Hi guys, this is Erica from Gokche Capital.
Now before I begin, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications. At the time that I was working in affordable housing, the attention of my team was turned to a historically sleepy corner of one of the old industrial neighborhoods in New York City. The area in recent years had suddenly awoken, and rents were rising as more and more people moved into the area, escaping high prices in other parts of the city. As the demand for affordable housing began to increase, the city came up with a plan. In its possession, the city had a few very small parcels of industrial land located in the neighborhood, which had previously been acquired through tax foreclosure decades ago. Originally thought too small to develop, these properties were now one of the last opportunities to build affordable housing. Perhaps, if they were bundled into one project and financed together, they could finally be developed. The problem? The lots needed to be rezoned to allow for a new use. Although, as it turned out, this was the least of the issues. I will cover the rest of the story later, but I bring up this one particular project to highlight perhaps one of the most impactful zoning tools available to cities and property owners, the rezoning. Well, my project was proposing a very small rezoning. Some of the most famous rezonings happen at a much larger scale, and perhaps the one of greatest fame in recent years is the citywide rezoning of Minneapolis. In 2020, this city became the first U.S. jurisdiction to ban single-family zoning in every neighborhood. The rezoning came out of a series of contentious debates centered around both racial equity, but also concerns over how the city, which had seen rapid population growth, was going to meet its projected future housing demands. The city had no way to expand its boundaries, and even if there were enough developers eager to build new housing stock, zoning regulations meant that most lots in the city couldn't legally be redeveloped to achieve a greater density. The result was to turn to the homes that, prior to the rise of low-density zoning in the 1940s, used to be a vital part of the starter home fabric, the duplex and triplex. Now, these structures are no longer as prevalent anywhere as they used to be, but I do remember my uncle talking about the stories he heard from his parents of growing up in an immigrant neighborhood dominated by duplexes. And he had a great affection for this building type because, as he said, this was the kind of building that allowed hardworking immigrant families to be able to enter home ownership thanks to the help of the rental income from the second unit. At the end of the day, the city of Minneapolis seemed to agree with this assessment, for in the 2020 adoption of the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan, duplexes and triplexes will now be allowed throughout the entire city. But whether a small area rezoning or a citywide rezoning, as a property owner, rezonings are one of the processes that you should know about, regardless of whether you think you would like to apply for one yourself. So in today's video, I'm going to go over some of the top things you should know as you get started learning about rezoning. Number 1. Zoning itself is a set of laws that control land use. Zoning laws will be outlined in a zoning ordinance. The point of this ordinance is to divide a jurisdiction into zoning districts. And these districts will be broken down by use. For example, there will be a residential district, a commercial district, an industrial district, and so on. In larger jurisdictions, there may even be several sub-districts. So, for example, a residential R1 district, R2, R3, and so on, each defined by a different kind of residential typology. So here's an example from New York City. You can see all of the residential districts here. And they range from R1, which are low-density single-family districts, to R10, which allow for large-scale multifamily residential buildings. So every property within a jurisdiction that has adopted a zoning ordinance will typically be located within one of the zoning districts. And each zoning district will have regulations on the allowable uses for the properties located within the district's boundaries. Therefore, a property in a residential zoning district can only be used for residential purposes, and a property in an industrial district will typically have to have industrial uses, and so on. The original point here was to separate potentially dangerous property uses, such as industrial uses, from residences. But most zoning ordinances will also have additional regulations baked into each district. So on top of regulations on allowable property uses, there may also be regulations on building heights, setbacks from property lines, and density. A district will not just limit a property to residential uses, but it may also limit how many units can be allowed on any one property. Now, there's a lot more to learn about zoning itself, but for the purposes of this video, it's important to know that the zoning district is regulating the kind of uses on a property as well as the density. And this is where rezoning comes in. Rezoning is the process of changing an area's zoning district. So in the example of my team's project, we are going to change the zoning district from industrial or manufacturing to residential. And the reason this is done is because there's a desire to use the land in a way that is not currently allowed. So in the case of my team's project, that whole area was no longer really being used for manufacturing, and the overall desire both of the city and the residents was that it become residential. But another reason why rezoning may be happening is not so much to change the use, but to change the density. So in the case of Minneapolis, the rezoning was not to change the overall use of the residential neighborhoods being rezoned, but rather to allow a greater number of units on each lot. Thus, rezoning can be a very, very powerful tool. But before you get too excited, it's important to also understand that many jurisdictions do not allow spot rezoning. That is to say, the rezoning of only one property. In fact, even in the case of my team's small proposed rezoning, we would not be rezoning only the lots that were part of the project, but the block on which the lots were located. And most cities only want this to be done if it is for the benefit of the larger community. After all, if every property owner was able to easily contest the zoning on their property, it may undermine the zoning ordinance altogether. So if you are a property owner and you're thinking of rezoning your property, before going any further, check to see if a spot rezoning is even allowable. So even if you are allowed to rezone your property, or if you think that you can band together with a few neighbors to propose a rezoning of a larger area like a block, keep in mind that the process will be long and arduous, and there is certainly no guarantee that you will be successful. Every jurisdiction has a slightly different process, but at a high level, it will often look something like this. First, you will have to research the local rules. Understand every step in the rezoning process before you attempt to undertake it, and put in some effort to think about how you are going to prove to the local jurisdiction that your rezoning has a larger public benefit. If your rezoning seems to only be for the purpose of your own profit, then it is unlikely to pass. Next, you'll want to speak with your neighbors. You may want to band together with a few neighbors to propose a larger area rezoning, but in addition, a rezoning is going to involve a number of public hearings. And this means that neighbors can come and speak in opposition of your project. And often, whether a rezoning is going to be approved or not will come down to how forcefully neighbors or local community groups speak either for or against your project. Therefore, you'll want to gauge what the public reaction is to your proposed project. See if there are people who will adamantly oppose it, and see how many local groups and neighbors you can bring in as advocates and partners in your project. Once you've done your research, and you believe that you have a strong argument and support from the community, then you can submit your application to the local planning department. At this stage, it's helpful to hire a professional to help you with your application, whether that's an architect, consultant, planner, or zoning attorney, or perhaps a couple of these different entities. But regardless of who you have on your team, you'll want to make sure that your application is thorough and complete. The planning staff will then review the application, first for completeness, but then to make sure that there is a legitimate public interest argument in favor of the rezoning. There may be a lot of back and forth with planning staff, and you should expect that you'll have to change your proposal in order to get planning staff sign-off. Once the staff has approved your application, it will likely go to a planning commission hearing. And this will be a public hearing, where again, any member of the public is able to come and speak either on behalf of or against your project. In many jurisdictions, the final step of the rezoning process is a legislative hearing. Again, a rezoning is typically considered a change to law. And this is very important to understand, because ultimately to be successful in your rezoning, you will not only need buy-in from the neighborhood and the larger community, but also from your local officials. Number 6, because a rezoning is public and often requires the buy-in from many different parties, it helps to have an expert assist you in the process. Architects and planners are useful in putting together your technical package, but a local real estate lawyer or consultant who specializes in zoning and who may also have contacts with local officials can be very helpful, not only in assisting you to understand what is possible under the law, but also to make sure that you have access to all the various groups and officials that you may need to speak with in order to get buy-in for your project. The rezoning process can easily become political, so as you can imagine, it may be contentious and difficult, which is why expert help can be a tremendous asset. But to return to my rezoning project, in this case, the project difficulties actually arose from the complications of scattered site infill development. Since the project sites were tiny and blocks apart from each other, getting costs to a reasonable level and finding sufficient funding were the primary concerns. The rezoning itself in this case was not so controversial. After all, it was clear that the area was no longer used for industrial purposes. Contrast this with the much more ruckus debates around other rezonings, such as Minneapolis's, that center on changes to the density of existing residential neighborhoods. There are almost always strong opinions on both sides, from existing homeowners who benefit from the rising home prices that come from high demand, to new home buyers who argue that low-density zoning is pricing them out of home ownership. Leaving aside some of the more sophisticated arguments that proponents of density-related rezonings propose, this is why rezoning projects can become so difficult. They are often emotional, for they pit different notions of property rights against each other. One person's perceived right to protect their investment against someone else's right to use their property as they would wish. For this reason, you should be very careful when thinking about buying a property that would need a rezoning to be used as you would like. Do your research first and understand what exactly you will be getting into when it comes to rezoning. Now, do you have any stories about rezoning? Let us know in the comments. Did you like this video? You're going to love our Gokche Land Due Diligence program. We'll make you a land due diligence expert in just 7 days. Check it out at gokchecapital.com/glad. And while you're at our website, don't forget to explore our $1 down properties at gokchecapital.com/listings. Finally, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. You can email, call, or text, and we will respond as soon as possible. So thank you for listening, and more to come.